All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're going back in time, back to 19th and early 20th century India.
Sounds exciting.
We'll be using Chapter 9 of a brief history of modern India as our guide.
Oh, a classic. I'm familiar with that one.
You might think, oh no, not another history lesson. But trust me,
Yeah, I know what you mean.
this chapter is far from your typical, dusty textbook stuff. We're talking about a period of incredible social and religious upheaval in India. It was like this massive clash between old traditions and completely new ideas.
Yeah, it's fascinating how all these reform movements emerged when India was under British rule and dealing with all this Western influence.
Right,
But they weren't just reacting to colonialism, though.
right.
They were also trying to address these deep-rooted social issues within Indian society itself, like, things that had been problems for centuries.
It's like almost a perfect storm brewing, right? You've got this external pressure from the British, but then at the same time, you've got this internal push for change, a real questioning of, how have we always done things?
Absolutely. And what's really amazing is that this whole push for reform wasn't just limited to one religion or one region.
Right.
We see movements springing up all across India in both Hindu and Muslim communities. It really shows how widespread this yearning for change was at the time.
So where do we even begin to untangle this web of reform movements? It feels a little overwhelming.
Well, I think a good place to start would be with Raja Rammohan Roy.
Yeah.
He's often called the father of Indian Renaissance.
Oh.
He was a real trailblazer,
Yeah.
a visionary, advocating for ideas that were, considered radical at the time.
Father of Indian Renaissance. That's a pretty big title.
Yeah.
What makes him so important in this whole story of reform in India?
Well, Roy was a big champion of monotheism,
Okay.
the belief in just one God, which was a huge challenge to the polytheistic beliefs that were, prevalent in Hinduism at the time. And he even founded the Brahmo Samaj. It was this new religious society that completely rejected idol worship
Interesting.
and instead emphasized reason and social reform.
So he's shaking up religious beliefs and tackling social issues. What kind of social reforms did he focus on?
So one of his biggest contributions was his absolute fight against sati,
Right, right.
that horrific practice of widow burning.
Yeah,
Just imagine the courage it must have taken to challenge such a deeply ingrained tradition.
yeah.
Roy would actually go to cremation grounds, trying to stop these terrible events from happening.
Wow, that's really putting your beliefs into action. It makes you wonder, what was it about this time period that made people like Roy speak out? Was there something like in the air, so to speak?
I think it was a time of incredible intellectual energy. Western ideas were flowing into India.
Yeah.
Printing presses were spreading new knowledge.
Yeah.
There was this growing awareness of social injustices, and all these things kind of combined to create this atmosphere where change felt possible,
Yeah.
inevitable even.
So it's this convergence of ideas and events that kind of set the stage for all these movements.
Exactly.
And Roy, with his bold ideas and his actions, he becomes a symbol of this era.
Absolutely.
But the Brahmo Samaj was just the beginning, right? A whole wave of movements followed.
Absolutely. The Brahmo Samaj was like a spark that ignited this firestorm of reform across India.
Wow.
New movements popped up, each with its own unique, flavor and
Yeah.
focus, but all of them united by this common thread of, challenging the status quo.
So let's talk about some of these other movements. Who are some of the other key players that emerge kind of alongside the Brahmo Samaj?
Well, you had the Prarthana Samaj in Bombay,
Okay.
and it shared some similarities with the Brahmo Samaj, but it was more focused on, social reform
Okay.
rather than just, strict religious doctrine. You could say it was trying to modernize Hinduism
Right.
to make it, relevant to the changing times.
So they were adapting.
Yeah, adapting.
Instead of clinging to tradition, were there any movements that took a more, maybe a more radical approach? Pushed the boundaries even further?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Young Bengal movement, led by Henry Derozio, he was a really charismatic guy. Derozio, he had this mixed Portuguese and Indian background,
Interesting.
and he basically encouraged his students to question everything.
Wow.
Religion, tradition, British rule, everything. He was a real firebrand. Sadly, he died very young.
Yeah.
But even so, his impact was huge.
It's amazing how these movements were led by such different people, each with their own background, their own approach. It
Yeah.
really shows how broad and deep this reform movement was.
And it wasn't just limited to, urban intellectuals either.
Right.
Another important figure was Jyoti Bafule.
Okay.
Now, he came from a very humble background,
Okay.
and he dedicated his whole life to uplifting the lower castes and promoting women's education. He started the Socio-Cultural Samaj,
Okay.
which directly challenged the caste system
Right.
and the inequalities that came with it.
I think I read that he also opened a home for widows, which seems like a radical act of compassion for that time.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Phule and his wife, Savitribai, they were true pioneers. They opened a school for girls, campaigned against child marriage, provided refuge for widows who were often, completely shunned by society.
It's amazing how they weren't just talking about change, they were living it,
Yeah,
putting their beliefs into action. They
absolutely.
were challenging religious dogma, but also like these ingrained social norms.
It's fascinating, right? So you
Yeah.
have all these movements, they have all these diverse approaches,
Yeah.
but they also have these common goals.
Okay.
Promoting education for women, for lower castes,
Okay.
challenging the caste system as a whole, and pushing back against all these outdated rituals and practices.
It's like they were all striving for a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely.
But was this reform movement just limited to the big cities or did it reach other parts of India?
It wasn't just a big city thing at all.
Yeah.
It really took root in different regions, with movements tackling specific issues relevant to their communities.
So it sounds like this reform movement was really a nationwide awakening.
Yes, definitely.
Can you give us some examples of these regionally focused movements? What issues were they tackling?
Well, one example that really stands out is the SNDP movement in Kerala.
Okay.
They focused on the Azavas, a community that was considered untouchable at the time.
Right.
And they were fighting for basic rights, access to education,
Wow.
and end to discrimination.
And how did they go about challenging these deeply ingrained prejudices? Was it through legal means, social activism, or a combination of both?
I'd say it was a multi-pronged approach,
Okay.
combining social activism, education,
Okay.
and even a kind of spiritual reform. One of their key figures, Sri Narayana Guru, he challenged the caste hierarchy in a really symbolic way.
I'm curious to hear more about that.
He installed a rock as a Sivalinga,
Okay.
which is a representation of Shiva, the Hindu god. I see.
And this was a huge statement because it challenged this idea that only Brahmins, the highest caste,
Right.
could consecrate such symbols.
That's such a fascinating example of how they used symbolism
Yeah.
to challenge these existing power structures. And what was the reaction to that? Did it actually lead to any real changes for the Azavas?
Oh, Srinarayana Guru's actions really resonated with the Azava community. I mean, they had been traditionally denied access to temples and religious rituals.
Wow.
This act of defiance, combined with movement's emphasis on education and social upliftment,
Yeah.
it really helped empower them and challenge this rigid caste hierarchy in Kerala.
So like a ripple effect, starting with this symbolic act,
Exactly.
leading to broader change. Were there any other regional movements that stand out in this whole story of reform?
Yeah, another one was the justice movement in Madras. They were focused on securing jobs and political representation for non-Brahmins.
I see.
They wanted to challenge the dominance of Brahmins in social and political life.
Argued for a more equitable distribution of power and resources.
It seems like all these movements were pushing for a more inclusive and representative society.
Yeah.
They were taking the ideals of the broader reform movement
Yeah.
and really applying them to their specific context.
Right. So they're all fighting for a more just and equitable India.
Yeah.
But they're addressing the unique challenges and inequalities of their specific communities.
It's a reminder that social change often starts at the local level,
Absolutely.
with people organizing and advocating for their own communities. But all these regional movements were still part of this bigger, nationwide movement for reform.
Yeah, they were all connected, inspired by each other, all part of this wave of change sweeping across India.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this really fascinating period. We've met some amazing reformers and explored all these different movements, but there's still so much more to unpack.
Yeah, we've just begun our deep dive. Next, we're going to talk about Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda. They had this unique approach to reform, blending spirituality and social activism. And then we'll delve into Dayananda Saraswati, who was this fiery reformer who called for a return to the purity of the Vedas.
So much to look forward to. This is going to be a fascinating journey through this really pivotal period in Indian history. Stay tuned, everyone. There's much more to come.
Absolutely. Welcome back to our deep dive. As we talk about these movements, it's important to remember they weren't just theoretical debates.
I see what you mean.
This wasn't just intellectuals sitting around discussing philosophy.
Right.
These movements had real impact, tangible effects on people's lives.
Yeah.
Especially for those who'd been marginalized for centuries.
It's a good point. It's easy to get lost in the details, the dates and names.
Right.
But at the heart of it, these were people fighting for something better, for their future, for their community's futures.
Exactly. And one of the most striking things about this period is how those ideals were actually turned into action. Real, concrete changes.
Yeah, like pushing for legal reforms.
Exactly. Reforms that challenge traditions and social norms that were so deeply rooted.
So what were some of the big legislative wins that came out of these movements?
Well, remember Raja Rammohan Roy and his fight against sati,
Yeah.
his tireless advocacy, the efforts of other reformers, and, let's be honest, pressure from the British.
Right.
Well, it all led to the Bengal Regulation of 1829. It officially made sati illegal.
That's huge. I mean, to outlaw a practice so tied to tradition, that must have been incredibly difficult. How did they manage to change people's minds and get that done?
Reformers like Roy, they combined moral arguments, appealing to basic human dignity,
Yeah.
especially the dignity of women. They formed alliances with British officials who were also increasingly critical of sati.
Interesting.
And they were smart. They used the printing press to really spread their ideas and get public support.
It really shows their dedication and their political savviness, too, to navigate all that and get it done. But the fight for women's rights didn't end there, right? What else were they working towards?
Oh, absolutely. The Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1856 was another big victory. It finally allowed widows to remarry.
Wow.
Can you imagine? Before that, widows were basically condemned to this life of isolation and hardship because of these age-old taboos.
Now, it's amazing how these reformers chipped away at those traditions, bit by bit, making things more just and equal. Were there other legal reforms they were fighting for, specifically for women?
Yes, the Age of Consent Act of 1891, although it was pretty controversial at the time, tried to protect young girls from being married off too early.
I can see how that would be controversial.
It really stirred up this whole debate about tradition versus individual rights,
Yeah.
showed just how complex things were, this mix of social reform and cultural sensitivities.
It's like these legal battles were a reflection of deeper tensions playing out. But did these reforms solve all the problems women faced? Or were there still issues that remained unaddressed?
Well, these were definitely big steps forward, but let's be real. The path to true gender equality, it's a long one. The SART Act in 1930 raised the age of marriage again, but enforcing it was tough, especially in certain parts of the country. And then there were ongoing issues, things like property rights, domestic violence, and just basic equality in education and jobs. Those problems persisted.
So it was a constant struggle.
It was like this back and forth between these progressive ideals and the reality of these deeply rooted norms.
I'm curious, what about the caste system? Were there any laws that directly addressed that?
Trying to dismantle something as deeply ingrained as the caste system through law, that was and still is incredibly complicated. Remember, it wasn't just a social hierarchy. It was woven into religious beliefs and practices.
Yeah, that's true. So how did reformers even approach something so huge? Was it even possible to legislate against something like that?
Getting rid of it completely wasn't realistic, but they did start to chip away at its foundations by focusing on education and social mobility, especially for lower castes.
So it was more about empowering people rather than just changing laws.
Yeah, it was about challenging the whole idea of what made someone pure or impure, arguing that all human beings are inherently equal.
It sounds like slow, hard work, but important work. One thing I kept thinking about from the chapter was there really a movement that installed rocks as symbols?
Ah, you're talking about Sri Narayana Guru, the reformer we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
He challenged caste hierarchies in a very symbolic way, remember. He took a rock and made it into a Sivalinga,
Okay.
a representation of Shiva. It was a bold statement.
So why a rock?
Yeah.
And why a Sivalinga specifically? What was the message there?
By making that rock into a Sivalinga, he was challenging the idea that only Brahmins, the highest caste, could perform such rituals.
Ah, I see.
It was about claiming spiritual authority and rejecting the caste system's whole claim to be divinely ordained.
So how did people react? Did it cause outrage among Brahmins, or did it resonate with people who felt marginalized by the caste system?
For the Azava community, it was powerful. They saw it as a symbol of their own worth. their spiritual equality.
Yeah.
It was an act of defiance against the system that had shut them out of temples and rituals for so long.
It's a good reminder that change isn't always just about laws. It's about symbols, too. Symbols that challenge beliefs and power structures. We haven't talked too much about the Muslim reform movements yet. How did they respond to colonialism and these new ideas coming in?
Well, the Muslim response was pretty diverse. Different movements had different interpretations of what Islam's role should be in a changing world.
So let's break down some of those movements. What were the main differences in how they approached things?
One prominent movement was the Aligarh movement, led by Sir Syed Mehdi Khan.
Okay.
He believed that Muslims needed to embrace modern education if they wanted to thrive.
Okay.
Adapt to this society that was increasingly shaped by Western ideas and institutions.
So it was about finding a way for Islam to coexist with modernity, with progress.
Exactly. He was all about a rational interpretation of Islam, showing it was compatible with science, social reform. He even founded the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which later became Aligarh Muslim University. It's a top university in India today.
Sounds very forward-thinking.
Yeah,
Empowering Muslims through education and engaging with the modern world. Were there any movements that took a different approach? Maybe a more, I don't know, a more conservative stance?
Yes, there was the Deoband school that came up around the same time, but they were much more traditional.
Okay.
They focused on preserving Islamic traditions and scholarship.
Yeah.
Interestingly, they initially were resisting Sikh rule in Punjab.
So their idea of jihad or struggle, it was directed at the Sikhs at first, not the British.
Right, exactly. It just goes to show you have to look at the nuances. You can't oversimplify things. Later on, some Deoband scholars did advocate for resistance against British rule, but their emphasis was always on a spiritual, intellectual jihad focused on education and moral reform.
It seems like both Aligarh and Deoband, even with their different approaches, were ultimately concerned with protecting Islamic identity and values in a world that was changing so fast. Yeah. Were there any other big Muslim reform movements during this time?
Yes, the Ahmadiyya movement. They had a really unique message, very liberal and universalist.
Ahmadiyya. I haven't heard of that one before. What were their main beliefs? What made them stand out from the other movements?
They believed in a universal religion, one that embraced all faiths. They emphasized peace, tolerance, dialogue.
Okay.
And they believed that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, their founder, was the promised Messiah and Mahdi.
Okay.
A figure who would bring about a new era of spiritual enlightenment.
That's fascinating. So they were trying to bridge the gaps between religions. Seems very progressive, especially during a time with so much religious tension and conflict. But did they face any pushback for their beliefs?
Oh, they did, especially from more Orthodox Muslims who saw their ideas as heresy. They were ostracized, sometimes even met with violence. But despite that, they kept spreading their message of peace and tolerance.
It just shows challenging the status quo, whether it's in religion or society, often comes with a price. But these reformers, both Hindu and Muslim, they were really driven by a vision for a better future.
And we have to remember, these movements weren't just one big unified bloc.
Right, right.
There were internal disagreements and debates within each movement.
That makes sense.
It reflects how complex the issues were and the fact that there were diverse perspectives within each community.
So it was this dynamic, evolving process, lots of different groups, individuals, all pushing for change in their own way, but ultimately they were all united by that common goal, a more just, equitable, modern India.
Precisely. You could say they were all, each in their own way, architects of a new India, an India trying to break free from its past and embrace the possibilities of a new future.
It's been amazing to explore all these different movements, how dynamic and diverse they were. We've seen how they challenged those in power, fought for social justice, and really laid the groundwork for a more modern and inclusive India. But now I'm thinking about their legacy. How did they actually shape the India we know today? That's a question I'm hoping we can tackle in the last part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this incredible journey exploring all these social and religious reform movements that really just swept through India in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
It's been quite a ride. It's amazing to see all these individuals, all these movements, each with their own way of doing things, but all challenging the norm.
Yeah, fighting for a better future.
Exactly.
But, thinking about it now, how did these movements actually shape the India we know today? What's their lasting impact? What's their legacy?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's like, when you drop a stone in a pond and the ripples spread out,
Yeah.
their influence is still felt today, sometimes in really subtle ways, sometimes in huge ways.
So how do we even start to trace those ripples? What are like the biggest, most significant legacies of all these movements?
I think one of the most obvious is their role in India's independence movement.
Oh, interesting.
By challenging traditional authority, pushing for education, and creating this sense of national identity, they helped set the stage for a united struggle against British rule.
So they weren't just about social and religious reform.
Not at all.
They were like setting the groundwork for a political revolution.
Exactly. They were awakening this sense of, agency and empowerment among Indians. They made people question the legitimacy of colonial rule. They inspired people to imagine a different future.
And after independence, did their influence continue to shape the newly independent nation?
Absolutely. Think about India's constitution,
Okay. Yeah.
adopted in 1950. It has all these values enshrined in it. Equality, social justice, getting rid of untouchability, the separation of religion and state.
Right.
All these principles were directly influenced by the struggles and ideals of these reformers.
It's amazing how these movements, which started decades before independence,
Yeah.
really helped shape the very foundation of modern India.
Yeah, they did.
But it wasn't just about laws and institutions, right? How did these movements impact Indian society on a more personal level, like everyday life?
That's where their impact is maybe the most profound. They changed how people thought about themselves, their relationships, their place in the world. They encouraged people to think critically, to question old traditions, to be open to new ideas.
It's like a shift in how people think, a move away from just accepting things blindly.
Yeah, exactly. And this shift had a huge impact on everything. Education, family structures, social interactions. It helped pave the way for a more modern, progressive society.
But I imagine not everyone was happy about these changes.
Of course not. Change is hard, especially when it challenges people's beliefs and who has power.
Right.
Reformers faced a lot of opposition, everything from social ostracism to, accusations of heresy,
Oh, wow.
even physical violence in some cases.
It must have taken so much courage to stand up to all that. What kept these reformers going, despite all the pushback?
They truly believed in their ideals. They had this vision for a better future. They believed a more just, equitable, enlightened India was possible.
Yeah.
And they were willing to risk everything for that vision.
It's inspiring to think about their dedication, their commitment. Do you think their dreams for India, did they fully come true? Did they achieve everything they set out to do?
It's tough to say. I mean, India today is still facing a lot of those same issues, right? Caste discrimination, gender inequality, religious tensions. Those problems are still there.
So it's like their work isn't finished.
In a way, the work of reform, it never really ends. It's always ongoing.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
A constant striving for a more just and equitable society.
It's like a relay race.
It is.
Each generation picks up the torch and keeps running.
Exactly.
So what would you say is the biggest takeaway, the most important lesson we can learn from all these reformers and their movements?
I think their greatest legacy is that power of questioning the status quo, never giving up on trying to build a better world.
It's a powerful message. And it goes way beyond 19th and 20th century India, right? It applies to all of us to be agents of change in our own lives and communities.
Absolutely. These movements remind us that even small acts of courage, small acts of defiance, they can have a ripple effect, creating waves of change that can transform whole societies.
It really makes you think. History isn't just something in a textbook. It shapes who we are and what our future will be. And by really understanding it, learning from those who came before us, their struggles and their victories,
Yeah.
we can find inspiration and guidance for our own lives.
I think that's maybe the most enduring legacy of all these movements. They inspire future generations to keep fighting, keep pushing for a more just, equitable, and enlightened world.
What a great note to end on.
It is.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey through such an important period in Indian history.
It was a pleasure exploring all of this with you.
Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep those hearts open, and keep on diving deep.